Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really unpacking the fascinating roles artists play. So varied, right? Across different places, different times.
Absolutely. And we've got quite a mix of sources to dig into.
We really do. Personal reflections, articles on art under, tough political regimes, the whole artist versus activist thing.
And even looking at film versus social media for driving change. It's a broad sweep.
Exactly. So the mission, if you like, is to get a real feel for how artists connect with society, the pressures, the impact.
And for you listening, if you want to get smart on this stuff quickly, see all the angles.
This should be packed with, well, maybe some surprising insights.
Definitely. It's clear right off the bat there's no single answer. An artist's role just shifts so much depending on context.
Okay, so let's dive right in with those archetypes. One source mentions Caroline Myss, yeah, and the activist as a kind of guide.
Right, the guide archetype. And what's interesting is how it's defined.
Yeah, not just dogma, but teaching spirituality through, inner authority, genuine experience.
Exactly. It's less about telling you what to think, more about guiding you how to connect with something deeper, something authentic within yourself.
Which connects beautifully to this idea of artistic truth, doesn't it?
It really does. If you see the artist as that kind of guide, their role isn't just entertainment or even direct politics necessarily.
It's maybe about leading us to new ways of seeing through their authentic voice.
Precisely. That focus on genuine experience is key.
So the source then gets personal, talks about Sting, his music, documentaries, raising awareness on issues.
Environmental stuff, political things, yeah.
But then it hits you with that question. Can music actually stop something big, like a war or a major political event? Makes you pause.
It's a critical question. The limits of art's immediate power.
Right. Raising awareness is one thing.
But actually stopping tanks or changing policy, that's a whole different ballgame. Art might change minds one by one.
But pulling the political levers is something else.
Which leads to thinking about all the different hats an artist can wear.
Yeah, the source lists others beyond activists. Advocates, judges, kings.
Avengers, warriors. It really broadens the scope, doesn't it?
Totally. It suggests artists engage in so many ways, not just, capital A activism.
An artist as a judge could be offering sharp social critique.
Or a warrior challenging norms, provoking thought, even without being overtly political.
Exactly. Different modes of engagement.
Okay, this next part is really thought-provoking. How art works looking back, retrospectively.
Yes. The example of Cordillera of Dreams.
About the Chilean coup and that date, September 11th, 1973.
The coincidence is unnerving, isn't it? And how art lets us process that history.
Allows for reflection, maybe even collective regret. Makes you think deeply.
Sometimes that distance of time is needed for a deeper connection, a clearer understanding. Art creates that space.
And drawing those connections across time.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, shifting gears now. Authoritarian regimes.
A really complex dynamic. Control, propaganda, resistance.
The sources talk about regimes actively using art, pushing ideology, values, aesthetized politics, they call it.
Right. Mussolini apparently saw cinema as a powerful weapon.
A weapon. It shows how much these regimes value or fear culture's power.
They try to shape everything, create this environment where their ideology feels natural, internalized through art.
And the control methods are pretty chilling. Intimidation.
Flattery sometimes, trying to co-opt artists.
Censorship, obviously, from script to screen.
And the state becoming the sole employer, basically, controlling the purse strings.
The goal is just crushing dissent, molding artists into mouthpieces.
Exactly. Building a cultural machine that serves them. And it's not just the final product, it's the whole process.
Yeah.
Tight constraints.
But then there's the really dark side. Actual persecution?
Censorship, silencing, sometimes worse.
Yeah, thinking about the avant-garde in Russia, the Nazi degenerate art shows.
The gulags. It's a reminder of the real dangers artists face for just thinking differently.
That phrase, murderous hatred of intellectual brilliance, that really sticks with you.
It highlights that fundamental clash, conformity versus the very nature of art, which is about questioning, exploring.
But then you also see co-option, collaboration, artists accepting patronage.
Navigating the system, becoming part of the regime's institutions.
Maybe seeking recognition, status, treated like superior civil servants, as one source puts it.
Yeah, and that's where the ethics get incredibly murky. What compromises are made?
It's uncomfortable to think some might even feel, more at home in systems that seem to value them, even if it's for control.
Raises serious questions. But even then, there's often internal conflict, resistance.
That core artistic drive versus political demands, art as making versus politics as doing.
Creativity getting stifled by fanaticism.
And sometimes artists initially align, then recoil at the brutality.
Yes, or young intellectuals using art subversively, imagining alternatives.
So the relationship is never simple. Even state art might reveal contradiction.
Exactly. The human spirit, that creative urge, finds ways.
Okay, let's pivot now. Artists versus activists. Often distinct roles, right?
Yeah, the source talks to that this slippage, especially in times of conflict.
And that personal story from the author as a Marine public affairs officer.
Telling the Marine Corps story, but with borders around it.
Contrasted with those raw, unsettling stories from Iraq that didn't fit, that image of the weeping doctor.
It perfectly captures that tension. Official narrative versus the deeper, messier human truth artists often explore.
Which leads to this idea that fiction, maybe art generally, explores what happens before ideology takes hold.
Getting at those basic human realities, yeah. Before ideology becomes this butcher of reality, as the source puts it.
And the author's own journey, writing about war, moving them from certainty to confusion, that's telling.
It suggests art operates in a space that's maybe more fundamental, less driven by rigid frameworks, offering nuance.
And we see this tension playing out right now with the literary community and the Israel-Gaza conflict.
Absolutely. Open letters, cancellations, firings, intense debates.
Even within groups like PE America about free speech, the complexities.
It highlights the immense pressure when art and politics collide so forcefully. What is the role of artists, of institutions, in these moments?
Makes you question, is a narrow political approach best in crisis? Or do we need that faith in open expression in art?
And then the example of George Open in WWII.
So powerful, he literally stopped writing poetry.
To take direct action against fascism, recognizing moments when art feels insufficient.
No one need fiddle precisely at the moment that the house next door is burning.
Wow. It shows that sometimes direct engagement is the priority. But he also reflected later on how hard it is to force politics into poetry authentically.
Which brings us right to that distinction, the activist's job versus the artist's job. Activism versus truth.
And the idea that didactic, preachy art is often, well, excruciating.
Yeah, that critique of sanctimony literature, art focused on proving you have the right politics.
Like the example given Chain Gang All-Stars, where the message feels like a sledgehammer.
It raises that crucial point. Does the art suffer when the message overwhelms everything else?
And then Auden's point about literary talent and political common sense rarely overlapping.
With that list of brilliant artists holding questionable views. Pound, Yeats.
Celine Shaw Neruda. It's a reminder that artistic genius doesn't equal political wisdom.
And Picasso's Guernica. Artistic masterpiece? Sure. But maybe less effective as a media propaganda.
Right. Not initially embraced by the audience it was meant for. Its impact grew over time. Shows the gap between intention and reception.
And finally, Orwell in Spain. Idealism meets messy reality.
The infighting on the left, yeah. And that nuanced view of the enemy, the soldier holding up his trousers.
Such empathy, contrasting with that army manual advocating hatred for survival.
It perfectly illustrates the tension. Solidarity for change versus the writer's need for truth.
The risk of blindness for activists, and maybe uselessness for honest writers in a crisis.
A really poignant way to put it.
Yeah.
And the pressure today towards political messaging.
Versus the writer needing to be almost irresponsible, just staring at reality.
It's a deep conflict. Okay, so let's look at artists as activists more directly.
Keith Haring's view comes up. Artist as spokesperson, a bridge between what is and what could be.
And that responsibility to make art accessible. His AIDS work is such a powerful example.
Art helping us understand ourselves, our times.
It emphasizes that social responsibility, art engaging directly with urgent issues.
Then Brian Eno, artist as a modern shaman, generating confidence, interacting with social structures.
Yeah, and the meaning of art being shaped by audience interaction. That's an interesting angle.
And Morse Peckham art exposing us to a false world to help endure the real one.
These different takes show the many ways art can function. Subtle influence, psychological preparation.
But then the counterpoint, this expectation now that artists must be woke heroes.
Right, questioning that, contrasting it with historical aesthetic motivations.
Arguing artists don't have to be political. Feeling obligated can seem pretentious.
And skepticism about celebrities just jumping on bandwagons on social media, authenticity concerns.
There's also skepticism about music's effectiveness for activism. Trends fade.
Art alone rarely stops major events. It might turn fans onto issues.
But then individuals need to take up the actual activism, that activist archetype again.
And personal political posts online, often seen as feckless, ineffective.
Which loops back to intention and authenticity. Doing it just to appease others won't work.
You need real understanding of the issues, or it feels insincere.
And that balance between the art itself and the message.
Right. Critique of art driven by chasing fame or money versus dedication to craft. Personal vision versus temporary statements.
Authenticity is key for activist art to resonate.
But then there's the broader view. Art making us think, see, hear, act differently. Giving it moral force.
Pushing beyond the mechanical, reminding us who we are. Provocation.
Seeing the artist's work as a kind of moral obligation, shaping understanding beyond decoration. Banksy, Ai Weiwei.
Those are great examples of direct, provocative engagement.
But even then there's tension. Individual expression versus movement participation.
Herring feeling trapped by the art market, even while being encouraged to be subversive.
It shows the inherent contradictions, engaging with issues within the very structures you might critique. A constant challenge.
Okay, let's bring in the Kirk-Farnetto lectures. Soviet constructivism first.
Flourished early on, then suppressed in the 30s.
Replaced by state-mandated socialist realism.
A clear example of forcing artists to align with state ideology. Art shifts from potential revolution to state tool.
And then the U.S. side during the Cold War, using abstract expressionism.
Yeah, as a cultural weapon against the Soviets, showcasing American freedom.
Though its effectiveness as direct propaganda, as agitprop, is questionable.
Right, it wasn't overt political messaging, more symbolic, highlighting freedom of expression versus Soviet constraints.
We also hear about Venezuelan artists under a dictator creating high art of socialist solidarity.
Finding a way to work within the system, aligning with its aims.
And then contrasting Donald Judd's minimalism with totalitarianism, suggesting inherent resistance in some art forms.
Exactly. His aesthetic could be read as rejecting that rigid, grand, ideological art.
So, looking at authoritarianism, the artist's role is messy, varied.
Completely. State-approved art, suppression, integration, resistance.
Yeah.
It depends hugely on context, the regime, the artist.
Art as a weapon for the state or against it.
It's that constant negotiation between the creative impulse and state power.
Okay, finally, let's dive into Malcolm Gladwell on social media and activism.
His core argument. Social media lacks what real social change has always needed.
High-risk activism organized through deep personal connections, real danger involved.
That starkly contrasts with a lot of online activity, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The level of commitment, the personal risk in Greensboro, rooted in established networks, shared identity.
He stresses the dangers faced in the Mississippi Freedom Summer, too.
Really high-risk stuff, lives on the line, fueled by community bonds, shared purpose.
Again, very different from the lower stakes of much online activism. And Doug McAdams' research backs this up. Freedom Summer participants, driven by strong ties, previous activism history.
Not weak ties formed online. High-risk activism is a strong tie phenomenon, he says.
The research provides solid evidence. You need that trust, solidarity, support from deep connections to sustain risky action.
Gladwell compares the PLO's strong tie structure to al-Qaeda's weaker decentralized network.
And points to the Montgomery bus boycott. Sustained sacrifice, rooted in community.
Highlighting the different strengths. Strong ties for sustained, committed action.
Weak ties good for spreading info fast, but maybe lacking strategic depth or long-term commitment for big change.
And social media excels at building those weak ties.
Great for sharing information rapidly, like that Sidekick phone story he mentions.
A perfect example of weak tie networking. Information spreads like wildfire.
But that doesn't automatically translate into the coordinated, risky action needed for deep social change.
So as bottom line, social media is an upgrade for organizing weak ties.
But it doesn't replace the strong tie activism that has historically driven fundamental shifts.
It's a tool, but it doesn't change the fundamental dynamics of how major change happens.
Exactly. That often still relies on deep connections, trust, high commitment.
Okay, so wrapping this deep dive up,
Ah,
it's just incredibly clear how diverse these roles are for artists.
totally. Challenging norms, reflecting society, being used by power, engaging in movements, a huge spectrum.
And highlighting that constant interplay, that tension between the artist's vision and all these external forces.
Authoritarian states, social expectations, the art market itself.
Understanding these different roles, like we aimed for, really gives you a much richer, more nuanced picture, doesn't it?
Hopefully it sparks some aha moments for you listening about art's complex impact.
And it leaves us with something to chew on, right? In this age of instant communication, heightened politics.
Are those traditional lines between artist and activist blurring?
And what does that mean for art itself and for social change? Definitely something to keep thinking about.
Absolutely.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.